All right, so Revelation. I have fought it. I have tried not to do it. Y'all are persistent, so here we are. No, I really am very excited about doing this. I really am. But as we come to the book of Revelation, I think all of us will agree that this is probably, whether it should be or not, it's the most challenging book in the New Testament to us. Part of the reason I fought doing it is because not only is it challenging, it's also controversial. And this is sort of bad form, but I'm going to go ahead and let you in on something now. You will not agree with me 100% of the time as we go through this. I will not agree with you 100% of the time as we go through this. The subject matter, the issues, the questions that come about from a study of Revelation lead us into places where we just can't be 100% sure. We can be confident in our suspicions. We can even be confident in our interpretations, but we need to realize that those are interpretations. What I'm doing up here is an interpretation. What any of you are doing is an interpretation. Interpretations are man-made. They are not the Bible, and they are not infallible. All right? So we will do the best that we can, but I just want to go ahead and say that now. On the flip side of that, let me also say that when we come to those hot topic issues, things like the rapture, things like the tribulation, things like the millennial reign, all of that kind of stuff, even when you don't agree with me, I will do my best to always give you a very biblical argument. So, you know, if we come to issues of the rapture, we'll go look at all of those passages. We're not going to limit it just to Revelation, but we're going to go do the whole thing because Scripture interprets Scripture. That's the best way to read the Bible. That's the best way to study the Bible. Let the Bible tell you what the Bible means, right? So I'm not going to pass by those issues until I've given you a solid biblical argument for why I'm presenting them the ways that I am. Now, you can agree with me, you can disagree with me. That's fine. The wonderful thing about Christianity is all God asks us to get right is one thing, and that's Jesus, right? So as long as we get Jesus right, we're all good.
Well, you know, it's like I tell Rick all the time. You can agree with me or not, but I'm always right.
That's right. That's right. In my humble but correct opinion.
You have an opinion, but
Yeah.
you know, I'm right.
Yeah, that's right. All right. So when I'm out, Miss Dot's going to be teaching.
What I've been thinking about, especially Revelation, it would be the same with anything else in the Bible. It all points to Jesus.
That's right.
Even in Genesis 3,
Mm-hmm.
points to Jesus, and this is what, to me, the main thing to remember out of here is the blessed hope.
Right. Right.
Irregardless, we
Right.
know, we can all agree there's a second coming.
That's right.
We know how the book ends.
Right.
That's what matters.
That's right. That's right.
Because people speculate, I speculate.
I will speculate.
Scholars on TV, David Jeremiah, he's writing a lot of things. Or
Right.
these people that study this stuff. And sometimes they'll tell you it's speculation.
Right.
You know.
Right.
It's what this Bible points to, and that's Jesus, just like you said.
That's right. That's right. So that leads us into a nice moment where I get to say I don't claim to be a leading expert on prophecy. But my almost PhD kicks in whenever I'm looking at this because one of my areas, I do early 20th century lit, and then I also do apocalyptic literature. So you're getting that side of what I do. Now, granted, it's not biblical apocalypse most of the time, but still, the apocalyptic is the apocalyptic. It's destructive. It is total annihilation. It is what it is. So y'all are going to get the benefit of that, I guess, or maybe the curse of that. I don't know. We'll find out together. All right. So now that all of that stuff's out of the way, let's just get to it, shall we? So I'm just going to go ahead and warn you, I'm probably not even going to get to the text today because of introductory stuff. But we start with, what is Revelation? And isn't that a great question? What is it? I said in my little Facebook blurb that there are people you can't get out of Revelation, and there are people that you can't get in Revelation. That seems to be kind of the two extremes when it comes to Revelation. Part of that, at least for the people you can't get in it, and maybe for the people who you can't get out of it, it's a lot of things, right? It's a letter, it's prophecy, it's apocalypse, it's a sermon at times. Almost, I would say, everything that you see in the other 65 books of the Bible, John takes and smashes together in 22 chapters. And so it can make it really difficult to read because John is just kind of moving around in and out of different genres because he needs to speak to the unique situation of his own listeners. And that's one thing that we need to keep at the forefront as we're studying this. John has a particular audience in mind. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have future fulfillment. That doesn't mean that it lacks relevance for us. But it means that when John wrote Revelation, there were people whom he was writing it to in that time period. And so that's sort of why it comes together as this hodgepodge of different things. So we know he identifies the book in the first verse as an apocalypse. That comes from the Greek word apokalypsis, meaning unveiling or revealing, or as we have it, revelation. But then as we move on into verse 3, he refers to that revelation as prophecy. And then he goes into the formal aspects of a Greco-Roman letter, which you might be familiar with from Paul's letters or John's own letters, 1st through 3rd John. So what John is doing here is he's almost creating this new kind of writing that has never been done by Jewish authors, by Christian authors, even by secular writers of the time. Now, let me say something particularly about apocalyptic literature and about apocalypses in general. They are not prophecy. Now, what John gives us is prophetic apocalypse, but not all apocalypses are prophetic. As far as the Bible is concerned, I would say all apocalyptic literature is prophetic. We know from Ezekiel, we have passages in Isaiah, we have passages in Jeremiah, Zechariah, Daniel, of course, we've already been there and done that. Those are places where there are apocalyptic moments, and they are themselves prophetic. But not all prophecy is apocalyptic. So when I say that, we think about Isaiah predicting the virgin birth. That's not apocalyptic, right? He's talking about Jesus there. So what are the differences then? Prophets are primarily spokespersons for Yahweh. Now, Isaiah might be a little bit of a variation on that, but in almost every case, prophets are given a particular message related to a particular sin or set of sins or lifestyle or whatever that is characterizing the people that they're preaching to pretty much for that immediate moment. So if we think about whenever, anytime the destruction of Jerusalem is prophesied by any of these guys, it's always happening pretty near to when this prophetic voice is speaking. Even Jonah, you think about Jonah going to Nineveh. The reason he needed to go to Nineveh when he needed to go to Nineveh is because judgment was imminent. It was coming. And God is not a God of confusion. So they needed to know why that was coming. And so he was sending Jonah to do that. So these prophets are these spokespersons for Yahweh. They're given these messages and they go, this is why you have all these thus says the Lord kind of passages. Apocalypses, on the other hand, tend to be carefully constructed literary works. So instead of being sort of sermonic and somebody standing on the street corner kind of thing, and actually that is in some cases the way the prophets would have gotten their message across, apocalypses are a lot more formulaic. Part of that is because apocalyptic literature, Jewish apocalyptic literature, which is the tradition that John's coming out of, that apocalyptic literature emerges during a time of extreme persecution for the Jewish community. You've got the rise of very powerful empires, the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, etc. And so these writers who are doing this apocalyptic work are trying to undermine the power of the empire by writing and pronouncing these cataclysmic prophecies against the empire. So you got to think about this for a minute. I mean, we think, and maybe even have just seen in this recent election, what we think is a horrific result, because the Democrats are going to retain control of the Senate. The Republicans will be lucky if they get the House at this point, it looks like. We've got Biden in the White House. I mean, it doesn't really look like a particularly great day. But Biden is not Nero. Biden is not Domitian. Biden is not any of these guys running around here actively seeking and persecuting Christians for what they believe. You'll have to forgive me. All the things are doing weird. By the way, let me just put a parenthesis around that for a minute. Revelation scares Satan so much that whenever you say you're going to teach it or preach it, you start getting attacked. Ask me how I know. The past month or so hasn't been the best time of my life. And I know why. But Jesus wins. And that's why he doesn't like it. All right. So, going back to the empire business now. You've got these Jewish writers writing these apocalypses in times, in places, and in scenarios where they're being killed for what they believe. It's not just the tax exemption status of churches being up in the air. Like, Christianity will not end if churches have to pay taxes. Judaism, Christianity, early Christianity, they're under real threat. And so this is that environment that all of this is coming out of. These empires are so powerful that the only way that anybody can envision that something is going to change is if there's divine intervention that totally destroys them. Right? Now, I'm saying all of this understanding that what I'm talking about here is not just Revelation, although we see evidence of this kind of thinking in Revelation, but there are other apocalypses out there which claim to be Christian apocalypses, which claim to be Jewish apocalypses. There's an apocalypse of Peter, there's an apocalypse of Paul, there is the shepherd of Hermas, even in the pseudepigrapha you've got the books of Enoch, which have apocalyptic moments in them. The Dead Sea Scrolls, there's the War Scroll, which is apocalyptic and also prescriptive of a military Messiah. So that happens before Jesus comes on the scene. So this is a genre that really is kind of an old genre that John's stepping into, but he's doing it so differently. By the time we get to those later Jewish apocalypses and the early so-called Christian ones, these writers are not looking for God to bring about redemption within history. That ship has sailed in their mind because the empires are so powerful, the persecution is too extreme. Now what you see is they're picturing God bringing a cataclysmic end to history. Like the whole thing has got to stop. It has gone too far. It's too bad. It's just got to stop. But when it stops, it brings with it that redemptive conclusion for God's people. So we think about that in Revelation. We have all of the bowls, the plagues, and so forth and so on. And then we get to the end, and Jesus comes back at the second coming. His people reign with him for 1,000 years. They cast Satan into the abyss, and then new heaven and the new earth comes down. And everything is made perfect. So you see that, even there in Revelation. So we'll talk more about that as we encounter it, but I want to kind of turn to form and interpretive difficulties, I guess, for apocalypses, but especially Revelation. Revelation is structured around John's dreams and visions. Now, I don't know about you, but I have had a ton of dreams in my life that make zero sense. They make I'm not saying God was speaking to me in those dreams by any stretch of the imagination, but we know, based on the few dreams that we get to remember, they can be weird. They can be way out there. And science doesn't really do a good job of telling us why, right? Psychology doesn't really do a good job of telling us why. John sees dreams, John has dreams, John sees visions in kind of the same way. And what he's trying to do, and what makes this so hard, is John is using a very limited vocabulary to try to explain what he saw, try to explain the things that he experienced. I have the book on my shelf, actually. I don't remember the guy's name now. But he talks about part of the judgments in here, and I can't remember which one it is, but he says that was John's explanation for the atomic bomb, because there was no concept of modern warfare and war technologies and whatever like that. So this is the way that John had to explain it. That also keys us in on something else, though. Every generation has thought that they had the key to unlocking revelation. Every generation has thought they were the generation which Jesus would return in. Maybe we are, maybe we aren't. I don't know. I don't live, and this is my own personal conviction, I don't live my life expecting at any second to be raptured out of here. I live my life expecting that God's going to give me something else to do, and something else to do, and something else to do for his kingdom. And whenever that moment happens, whether I'm raptured out of here or I die, I will have done what I'm supposed to do for him. But if I lived expecting every moment, maybe he's coming, I would never get anything done. You know, I'd be constantly looking whichever direction east is.
But that's what we're supposed to be doing, looking for his coming, but working
till he comes. Right.
Not sitting down waiting. I'm here, Lord,
come get me.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's where we fail.
Right.
You know, we are not out there proclaiming God's word
right.
to those around us, whether it's family members, neighbors, or whoever we meet.
All right.
Actions have to speak, but we have to speak verbally.
Right.
And seek to serve, to be a servant.
Right. You're good. No, you're good. That brings up a good point, though. Why are the first 3 chapters of Revelation not jumping straight into all the apocalyptic gobbledygook? Because the church has got to be ready first. The assessment of the church has been made in the letters to the 7 churches. The churches know what they need to improve on. The churches know what they need to do better, because it's not about getting out. It's about being prepared to do his work until that time comes. You can't do that if you're bogged down in the business that, as we get there, we'll see that these 7 churches are bogged down in. You can't do that. So Revelation is written to the church. It's for the church. It's not for us to beat unbelievers over the head with and say, this is what's coming if you don't get your act together. Because the first person that has to realize that are the people in the churches to whom Jesus says, this is what's coming if you don't get your act together. I will remove your lampstand. I will destroy you individually before this other stuff starts. Okay, that was free.
Not to say that we are the generation that's going to be taken out, raptured, however we want to look at that. But as we look at the history and we look at the things that was prophesied, and we can see that they are culminating. Can't get the word out.
Culminating?
Yes, and just faster and faster and more and more. And that should be a clue that, hey, something is happening.
Well, the church is the least effective when it's complacent. And it's the most effective whenever it's scared. And I think sometimes, because you can go through history and you can look at places where it's just like one bad thing after another. I mean, the past 100 years in the United States haven't been a bed of roses. But it hasn't been for the rest of the world either. But then if you go back and you look at John's period, it was also pretty terrible. They didn't have the news media that we have to tell them all about all the things that were happening all over the empire, but we need not expect that Ephesus was any better than Jerusalem for the believer, right? It's bad. That's why this is the context this is in. So we have this forum that's centered around these dreams and these visions, catering to that oppression and persecution that they're feeling. And then we also have, and I touched on this a minute ago, this cryptic and symbolic language. When John tells us what he sees, especially whenever he sees a combination of things, like the woman clothed in the sun, for instance, we independently know woman, we independently know sun. We have no idea what he means when he says a woman clothed with sun, right? So the combination of those two familiar things for us is not a known reality. It's not, maybe it is, but we don't recognize it that way. And finally, apocalypses tend to be formally stylized. What I mean by that is every apocalypse has its little, its own little niche characteristic, maybe a good way to put it. So in Revelation, we got numbers everywhere. We've got 7s, we've got 10s, we've got 12s, we've got 3.5s, we've got 4 plus 2 plus 1. We've got numbers everywhere. That's not just Revelation, but Revelation, John really liked them in Revelation. So we have all of these things that we have to deal with, right? Weird language, visions and dreams, numbers all over the place, lions and tigers and bears, oh my. But when we think about Revelation, we can also realize that John abandons two key features of the Jewish apocalyptic tradition, one of which he identifies himself. He tells us who he is, and he tells us that he has seen or is giving the testimony of Jesus. So he identifies himself and he identifies as the messenger, if you will. And because of that, John abandons the fifth feature, so I gave you 3. Visions and dreams, weird language, numbers. Then we got the 4th one, except he identifies himself. They don't normally. And then fifthly, in the Old Testament, you remember Daniel. At the end, Daniel doesn't get to see the end. The angel tells Daniel, seal this up. Other apocalypses, the messenger says, seal this up. By the time we get to Revelation, Jesus doesn't say to John, seal this up. He says in verse 3, blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear and who keep what is written in it, for the time is near. So it's a different perspective now. This isn't written for a later date. This is written for that moment. John also has the unique perspective as a Christian prophet of somebody who isn't just anticipating the end, but he knows that the end began when Jesus was born, when Jesus died, when Jesus rose again, when Jesus ascended to heaven, because now we've got a new kingdom on the scene. So the end for John, and that's why we have a version of the birth narrative, a very weird version, but we have a version of the birth narrative in Revelation. That's why it's there, because for John, that's where it started. So John writes a word from God to these people, to their present situation, but he also writes against the backdrop of the future. And in the future, there is judgment, there is salvation, and there is ultimately God dwelling with his people. Now, I've been priming you for that for a long time in here. God's ultimate desire has been to reconcile creation back to himself so that he may dwell with his people again, not take his people to dwell with him, but that he may dwell with his people. Consider the Garden of Eden. Jesus walked with them in the cool of the day, or the Lord, but we take that to be Jesus. Walked with them in the cool of the day. Even after they sin, Jesus goes to them, says, "Where are you?" He doesn't mean, "Where are you?" He knows where they are, but he's there with them. They build a tabernacle so that the presence of the Lord can be in their midst. They build a temple so the presence of the Lord can be in their midst. The temple is destroyed. And then Jesus comes. And then Jesus ascends. And then the Holy Spirit comes. And then what? It's all over. And then God comes and dwells in his fullness with his people. So you can take a straight line and run it all the way through. God has been trying, we want to put it this way, and I know that's a dangerous language to use, but God has been trying to get his people right so that he can come back and dwell with them.
I heard a preacher saying that he preferred to say God purposed
Yeah.
that he would do this in order to bring us back to him, because he in his wisdom knew that Satan was going to deceive us.
Right.
So he purposed it that
He
way.
purposed it. I like that.
So he would bring us back.
Right.
His purpose is going to come to pass.
Right. Right. Okay, so when was it written? Thankfully, I don't have to spend a whole lot of time on this. There are differing opinions on it, but rather than give you all of that, I'll just tell you mine. I take a very traditional view. I think it was written by John the Apostle from the Isle of Patmos sometime between 90 and 96 AD. That's the end of the reign of Domitian. Now, I give you that understanding that what we know about the reign of Domitian has been greatly exaggerated. Domitian is viewed as this really awful, oppressive kind of emperor, and he was. All the emperors were, particularly those coming after Nero. But the thing about Domitian is we don't know that Domitian was actively going against people just for the sake of going against them. When Domitian decided to persecute somebody, he was persecuting them because they went against one of his laws, or they broke some Roman commandment of whatever degree. Nero, on the other hand, as an example, had soldiers out there hunting them down just for the sake of being Christians, just for the sake of being Jews. He just didn't want them there. So Domitian is not in that category. But what we can say is the church and the Jews have been persecuted for a very long time. They're already being persecuted by the time the Jews are. By the time Jesus comes on the scene, it doesn't stop. It just keeps going, and at times gets worse, and at times maybe gets a little better, and then it gets worse again, and then it gets a little better. So I think that's why John's writing it, or how he's writing it, the context that he's writing it in. And those are the people that he's speaking to. Okay, so great, Ian. You've spent a lot of time on all of that. Why does it matter? Why does Revelation matter? I'm going to give you a different list of reasons than you might expect. One, we need to see this world and our lives in this world through the perspective of heaven. We so often like to put our own spin on it. And what God has given us in Revelation is that heavenly perspective. That this is what's happening. This is where you are. This is why you're dealing with what you're dealing with. But also, Jesus wins. It's one of those rare moments, and we get so caught up in the symbolism and we get so caught up in the imagery that we miss, I think, one of the major points, which is God sees all of this. In some sense, he's already there. And now we get to see it. But of course, our little feeble human minds have a hard time dealing with it, right? So, we need to see this world and our lives in this world through the perspective of heaven. Secondly, I hope we want the blessing that is promised to those who hear and keep this book. But now here's my question to you, and I'm not going to answer it. What is the point of hearing and keeping anything in the book? What is in there for us that's actually intended for us to hear and to keep? Because I don't think, I'll give you a half answer. I don't think it's the interpretive stuff or the symbolic stuff. I don't think it's the weird stuff. I think we can't see the forest for the trees on that one. And then thirdly, we need to live out the story of Revelation. That's a scary thing to say. But we need to live out the story of Revelation. John reminds us in Revelation that God rules even in an evil day. He reminds us that God has not forsaken his people, and he reminds us that goodness will finally triumph and prevail. Some questions that he poses to us is, what do believers do when you live in Babylon? What do you do when you come face to face with Rome? The governments of the world are like ravenous beasts tearing apart the church. I mean, those are images that we get in Revelation. Those are images that we feel. Maybe not as intensely, but those are images that we feel. Think about the poor Christians in China. Think about the poor Christians in places like Myanmar. Think about the poor Christians in the Middle East. We got it good. So John tells us we must stay close to Christ, first of all. Secondly, we can't compromise with evil. Thirdly, we must endure to the end. And fourthly, we must look for the final reward. Here's another question that I won't answer. What is the final reward? You've got two options. As evangelical Baptists, let me put it that way, you have two options. Either the new heaven and the new earth, or the rapture. So what is the final reward? Okay, so now I'll talk about some comments on interpretation, and next week we'll actually start looking at the text. Some of you are not going to like me when I say this, but it'll be okay. As my great-grandmother would say, you can get happy in the same britches you got mad in. We need to replace, and I mean absolutely replace, like take it, pick it up, and put it on the shelf somewhere, throw it away, whatever it takes. But we need to replace an unhealthy fascination about the future with the determination to follow Christ in the present. Let me say that again. We need to replace an unhealthy fascination about the future with the determination to follow Christ in the present. Again, I say, what good are we? I think Kevin used this in a sermon one time. But don't be so heavenly minded that you're no earthly good. Right. Right. And that's what happens. We get so wrapped up.
So many people away.
You do. You absolutely do. One of the things that I think makes Revelation so controversial, there are people, I'm going to pick on Miss Dot and Brother Rick for a minute. These people know prophecy like the back of their hands. I mean, you want to talk about prophecy, stop and talk to Brother Rick on any given Sunday morning. He doesn't need notes. He doesn't need a book. It's just there. Others of us are not prophecy gurus at all. There are things that we would rather focus on in the Bible that aren't prophecy. That's fine. God doesn't cut people out with a cookie cutter. But what we wind up and do a lot of times, especially with Revelation, is if we think we understand it better, and I'm not saying y'all do, don't misunderstand me, but if you think you understand Revelation better than somebody else, you put yourself on a pedestal. I have the knowledge. I have the secret. I have the code. No, you don't.
I just have my opinion.
Right, right, which is always right.
That's what mine is, you know, I mean, I have an interest in history, I always have.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of what got me into this, that's what got me into the Old Testament.
Right.
About other things, I just love to read the Bible.
Right.
It's an age-old problem because Paul experienced it when Jesus returned. He
Right.
writes it and writes about it, and it's this way to today. But
Yep.
as long, it's good to debate
Right.
some things.
Right.
But Paul talked about disunity.
Right.
There be no arguments, no disunity. And as I commented the other night, you know, I'm very open-minded.
Mm.
God has blessed me.
Yeah.
And it's from God. I mean, people are closed-minded, narrow-minded, but I try to, I like talk about it, You know,
It is.
What if? A lot
Right.
of it's the what.
What ifs? Yeah.
You know, but that's with anything in the Bible, you know?
Right.
There's people, I read a lot on Facebook, I don't comment like I used to, but
Yeah.
I just like, that's where I like to read comments and some of these things.
Right.
Which translation?
Yeah, those are my favorite.
And that would be squashed pretty quick, you know? But there's
You would
some
think, but they don't listen.
Which guy?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
that's a lot of what, the bottom line is, it doesn't matter, I mean, it does matter, but they don't, they really don't, but they don't believe anyway.
Right.
It's just things they throw out there to start an argument.
Mm. Well, I will go ahead and tell you this before I move on, but if I ever get the feeling or the sense that what I'm saying or the conversations that we're having about Revelation are becoming a problem for the church, we will absolutely quit. We will not finish. I am not, none of us are bound to this, okay?
And I know probably you all that have been to college has read Josephus and, I can't even think of them. I've got a whole bunch of them on our bookshelf, but Enoch.
Right.
You know, y'all read it, and the book of Enoch says that his book is for those of the end time to understand. Okay, we're beginning to understand what he wrote through many of the Dead Sea Scrolls and
Right.
various things that have been unearthed, and the knowledge that we have, you know, with computers.
Right.
And it is just amazing. And a lot of times I'll say, well, the book of Enoch, or the book of, Chris says, oh, Mom.
But
It all kind of ties
It's an
together.
interesting book we got.
Right.
And Jude quotes from it.
Right.
It was a well-known book in their day.
Right.
But it's not the Bible.
It's
Right.
not the Holy Book, and this is all we need.
That's right.
It's interesting reading.
Right.
Quite possible what he, things revealed to him, quite possible.
Right.
You know, could be true, may not be true.
Right.
Is to take that with an open mind.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody, David Jeremiah, they're sharp.
Right.
The Hagee, you're sharp.
Yeah, I had my days.
Sharp. Very, very sharp, but there is no authority. Even Kevin, I'll throw it in.
Even Kevin.
The Glenn was sharp.
Yeah.
You know, but there's no authority
Right.
on this. We have to take it from this.
Right.
I'm well aware of that.
Right.
You know, my mind can be changed about my speculation.
Right. Right.
Or what I may comprehend or not
Mhm.
understand. But again, it all Jesus.
That's right.
That's the main emphasis.
Right. So I'm going to say a few more controversial things and then we'll stop. Revelation was not written to entertain us. It was not written to set out a timeline for the future or to satisfy our curiosity about when Christ will return. That might be in there, maybe, but that's not its point. In fact, almost all of the popular stuff written on Revelation really has a minimal, if any shred of responsible biblical interpretation to it. Yes, Left Behind, I'm looking at you. That is probably the worst thing in my estimation that ever happened to our interpretation of the book of Revelation is Left Behind, because it put so many people onto the wrong track about end times business. But we can tell. Yeah.
And we don't need that.
Nope.
It's good to talk about stuff, but we need to.
Right.
We're here to edify,
Right.
to build the church. That's all it's all about. And try to bring people to Jesus and bring ourselves closer to Jesus.
Right.
It's not about all this other stuff.
That's right.
You know, it is, but it's
Yeah.
Jesus.
That's right.
The bottom line.
Right. So, just a couple of things to keep in mind. I know I got to quit. First of all, I'm going to be concerned first with trying to figure out John's original intent. Once we figure out the original intent, we can make application with it in other ways if that's what we want to do. But let's get John's original intent as best we can. Secondly, we know we have these images. We know we have this symbolic language. We know some of those are constant, some of them are fluid, some of them are general, some of them are very specific. Interpreting all of that, again, is one of the most difficult things about Revelation. But I think the key, and I use that scary word with like all kinds of hedges around it, but I think the key to Revelation is to centralize the images that John explains to us. And he does give us 7, ironically, as a starting point for all the others. In chapter 1, verses 17 to 18, back in verse 13, he's talked about one like a son of man. In 17 and 18, he identifies the Son of Man as Christ, who alone was dead and alive forever and ever. In 120, we have the 7 golden lampstands, which are the 7 churches to whom John is writing. We also have the 7 stars, who are the 7 angels or the messengers of the 7 churches. In chapter 7, verse 14, we have the numberless multitude, those who have come out of the great tribulation and have washed their garments in the blood of the Lamb, a.k.a. the redeemed people of God. 12:9, the great dragon, Satan. 17:9, the 7 heads of the beast. 7 hills on which the woman sits, a clear allusion to the city of Rome, famous for sitting on 7 hills. But it also becomes a fluid image for 7 kings. And then in 17:18, the great harlot, which is the great city on the 7 hills, therefore Rome. That's what John gives us to work with as far as his own understanding. So, one of the things that I would urge you to remember, and this is the last thing I'll say, one of the things I would urge you to remember and to go ahead and commit yourself to over probably the next year or more that we're dealing with Revelation. It will take us a very long time. I wasn't kidding when I said June 2024. 2030? All right. Some of you will not see the end by that. No, I'm kidding. Kevin's got big eyes back there. I didn't say who. It may be us.
You said earlier that we need to start living it, and I started to say, well, I'll bring my horns this afternoon, let Doc bring her bowls. And
there you go. There you go.
Let's go ahead and start experiencing.
Yeah, that's good. But one of the things that we need to do is this. We want to rightly divide the word of truth, right? And so in order to do that, we don't need to press all of the details in Revelation to have some special meaning. And even if we think they do, that's not necessarily important to our understanding of Revelation. John is trying to say something to us by way of entire visions, of whole visions, and there are some details that are in there that are either for dramatic effect or they add to the picture as a whole so that we can't miss John's own point unless we focus on the details and not on the big picture. So that is what my final comment is on that. Don't get bogged down in the details. And as I said last week, go ahead and start reading now because I can't do it all. We would be here till 2030, 2035, 2040, so, whatever.
John is saying God's still in control.
That's right. That's right. All right.
And all sin, all death, all the devil, the demonic spirits, the evil, the sin, God's still he's still in charge of that book chest.
That's right. That's right. All right. Miss Nell, will you dismiss us?
Most likely, so when Father, so thankful to be here today in your house to worship. Father, we just thank you for the blessings of the week. Father, we just